Preface. Greetings, travellers. Welcome to NOVELLUX. You have found your way to a sanctuary of original epic fiction, crafted entirely by our imagination. If you have a passion for stories that haunt the soul, pause for a moment. Give this journey a chance. You might just find the world you've been looking for. If you've ever been captivated by the obsessive madness of Moby Dick, chilled by the visceral survival instinct of the Revenant, and perhaps heartbroken by the solitary resilience of Oliver Twist, then this is the story you deserve. So, pull your chair closer to the fire. Listen to the crackle of the wood, feel the rough texture of the page beneath your fingertips, and smell the faint, dusty scent of ink and history. You are safe here, in the sanctuary of your own mind. But outside these walls, beyond the comfort of your reality, the air is turning to ice. We are drifting into the year 1850, aboard a wooden beast groaning under the weight of greed and whale oil. We are about to descend into the crushing darkness of a ship's hold, to sit beside a boy who has forgotten the sound of his own voice. This is not merely a tale of shipwreck. It is a dissection of what remains of a human being when civilization is stripped away by the merciless frost of the Arctic. I must warn you, the ink on these pages smells of brine and old blood. To read is to feel the cold seep into your bones. You will hear the ice cracking before you see it. We do not ask for your judgment. The sea has already passed its verdict. We ask only for your witness. So wrap your coat tight. Take a deep breath while you still can. The lantern is flickering. Leviathan's Cradle. The story begins now. Volume 1, The Belly of the Beast. Chapter 1, The Heartbeat in the Wood. Darkness. It was not the absence of light. It was a physical weight, heavy and suffocating, like a damp wool blanket pressed against the face. Inside the barrel, the air was stale, recycled through lungs that were too afraid to expand fully. It smelled of old oak, of brine that had soaked through the wood for a decade, and underneath it all, the sharp copper tang of fear. Silas lay curled in the fetal position, his knees drawn up to his chest, his spine pressed against the curved staves of the cask. He was 14 years old, but in the dark folded upon himself like a discarded rag doll. He seemed much smaller. He did not move. He barely breathed. To breathe was to make a sound, and sound was the enemy. His world had shrunk to this, a diameter of 3 feet, a height of 4. This was his universe. Outside of this wooden shell was the Pequod II, a whaling ship bound for the slaughtering grounds of the northern Atlantic, and on its deck walked men who would throw a stowaway overboard as casually as they would toss a bucket of slops. But Silas had a secret, a weapon, though he did not yet know it as one. He closed his eyes, a meaningless gesture in the absolute pitch black, and let his other sense expand. Most people heard the ocean as a single, monotonous roar. Silas heard it as a symphony of violence. He heard the water rushing past the hull, separated from his ear by only 3 inches of oak. He heard the groan of the ship's ribs, the timber complaining as the vessel rolled into a trough. He could distinguish the high-pitched creak of the mainmast swaying 50 feet above, vibrating down through the keel like a plucked cello string. And he heard something else. Closer. Scritch. 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 Silas's breath hitched in his throat. His muscles locked, turning rigid as stone. It was inside the barrel with him. He felt the vibration before he felt the touch. A tiny, frantic energy. Then, the sensation of whiskers brushing against his ankle. The rat was large. He could tell by the weight of its paws as it stepped onto his boot. It was likely one of the grey wharf rats from Nantucket, fat on refuse and bold from survival. The animal paused. Silas could hear the rapid, fluttery beat of its heart, a stark counterpoint to the slow, terrified thud of his own. "Do not move," he screamed inwardly. The command echoed in his skull, bouncing off the walls of his mind, but it never reached his lips. His lips were sealed, not by thread, not yet, but by a terror so profound it had severed the connection between his brain and his tongue. The rat began to climb. It moved up the rough fabric of his trousers. The claws pricked his skin through the thin material. This fabric, it was all he had left of the land, a pair of oversized trousers he'd stolen from a drying line behind a tavern. They still smelled faintly of wood smoke and dirt, a smell that felt like a lifeline in this kingdom of salt. If he moved, if he kicked the rat away, the noise would be amplified by the barrel like a drum. The rat reached his knee. It paused again, its nose twitching, sniffing the scent of a boy who had not bathed in weeks. Thud, thud, thud. The sound from above froze the blood in Silas's veins. The rat froze too, its survival instinct aligning with the boy's. Those were not the scurrying steps of the sailors, light and quick. Those were boots with ironclad heels, heavy, deliberate, authoritative. Captain Ahab had his wooden leg. Captain Thorn of the Pequod II had his iron heels. He walked the ship not to navigate, but to dominate, to stamp his will into the very planks. Silas pressed his hand over his mouth, his fingers digging into his cheeks. The footsteps stopped directly overhead. Dust trickled down from the gaps in the deck planks above, falling invisibly onto the lid of Silas's barrel. He imagined the captain standing there. A man said to be carved from the same ice he hunted. A man who believed that silence was a sign of conspiracy. "Go away," Silas thought, the plea desperate and silent. "Please, let the sea take you elsewhere." But the footsteps did not move away. Instead, they descended. The hatch to the lower hold had opened. The change in air pressure was instant. The stale air in the barrel shifted slightly as a draft of colder. Fresher air swirled into the cavernous belly of the ship. Silas heard the strike of a match against a rough surface. Phi, hiss, light. It was faint, filtering through the microscopic cracks between the staves of the barrel, slicing the darkness with razor-thin blades of orange. "Rats," a voice grumbled. It was deep, gravelly, sounding like stones grinding together in a mixer. It was not the captain. It was the first mate, Mr. Garrow. "The whole bloody hold is teeming with them." "Find the source," a second voice replied. This one was smooth, cold, and dangerously calm. Captain Thorn. "A ship that feeds parasites will starve its crew. If you see movement, kill it." The rat on Silas's knee twitched. It sensed the predator. It dug its claws deeper into Silas's leg, preparing to spring. The pain was sharp, sudden. Silas bit his own tongue to suppress a yelp. The taste of copper flooded his mouth. The boots were walking between the rows of cargo. The Pequod II carried hundreds of barrels, supplies for a 3-year voyage. Salted pork, hardtack, flour, and empty casks waiting to be filled with the precious spermaceti oil. Silas was in a cask marked Flour, Grade B. He counted the steps. 1, 2, 3. They were getting closer. "This row," Thorn said. The voice was right outside the wood now. Silas could hear the rustle of this captain's heavy oilskin coat as he brushed against the barrels. "Some of these casks are lashed poorly. Tighten them." "Aye, Captain." A hand slapped the top of Silas's barrel. Thud. The sound was like a cannon blast in the confined space. The rat, panicked by the vibration, scrambled frantically up Silas's chest, its tail whipping across his face. It was too much. The terror, the pain, the claustrophobia. Silas didn't scream. He couldn't. But his body betrayed him. He flinched, his elbow knocking hard against the side of the barrel. Thump. Silence descended on the hold, a silence heavier than the darkness. The rat had vanished into the shadows of Silas's clothing, trembling against his stomach. Outside, the heavy breathing of the two men stopped. "Did you hear that?" Thorn's voice was a whisper now, sharp as a harpoon tip. "Rats, sir. Like I said, big ones." "No," Thorn murmured. The sound of his boots shifted. He was turning. He was facing the barrel. Rat skitter. That sound. That was bone against wood. Silas closed his eyes tight. Tears, hot and salty, squeezed out and ran down his grime-streaked cheeks. He hugged his knees, making himself as small as physically possible, wishing he could dissolve into the grain of the oak, wishing he could become nothing. He heard the sound of metal sliding against leather. The captain had drawn his blade, or perhaps a wailing lance. "Open it," Thorn commanded. "Sir, it's just flour." "Open it!" The roar shook the dust from the beams. Crack! Light blinded him. The lid was ripped away. The sudden influx of lantern light felt like a physical blow. Silas threw his hands up to shield his eyes, cowering at the bottom of the cask like a trapped animal. For a moment, there was no sound but the hiss of the lantern. Then, a shadow fell over him. A silhouette framed by the harsh orange glow. Captain Thorn peered down into the barrel. His face was a map of harsh lines and weather-beaten skin, his eyes the colour of a frozen sea. He did not look surprised. He looked disappointed. "Well," Thorn said, his voice dripping with icy amusement, "it seems we have caught a fish before we even saw the ocean." He reached down. His hand was enormous, wrapped in a thick leather glove. He grabbed Silas by the collar of his shirt, the shirt that smelled of land, and hauled him up. Silas hit the deck hard. The air was knocked out of him. He scrambled backward, crab-walking away until his back hit a crate. He looked up, trembling violently. The rat, dislodged from his shirt, scurried away into the darkness, squealing. "Kill it," Thorn said, pointing not at the rat, but at the boy. "Mister," Garrow hesitated. "Captain, it's a child." Thorn stepped forward, the lantern swinging in his hand, casting long, dancing shadows that looked like demons on the hull. He looked at Silas with a mixture of curiosity and disgust. "A child eats," Thorn said. "A child drinks. And this one..." He leaned in closer, studying Silas's face. "This one has the eyes of a coward. What is your name, boy?" Silas opened his mouth. He wanted to say Silas. He wanted to beg. He wanted to say, "Please, I have nowhere else to go." But nothing came out. His throat constricted. The invisible stitches of his trauma pulled tight. He gasped, his jaw working uselessly, but only a dry, raspy wheeze escaped. Thorn's eyes narrowed. He straightened up, towering over the boy. "Mute," the captain scoffed. "A mute stowaway. Useless." He raised his heavy boot. The boot did not crush his skull. Instead, it slammed into the crate right beside Silas's ear, splintering the wood with a violence that sent vibrations rattling through the boy's teeth. Silas flinched, curling tighter, expecting the second blow to find its mark. He could smell the captain's boots, a mixture of polished leather, whale oil, and something metallic like dried blood on a rusty blade. "Captain, Mister," Garrow intervened, his voice low but urgent. "We are short a hand. Old Miller died of the flux 2 days out of port. We need someone to scrub the try-works, someone small enough to crawl inside the furnaces." Thorn paused. The heavy boot remained planted next to Silas's head, a pillar of judgment. The captain looked down at the shivering boy. He didn't see a human being, he saw a tool, a broken, defective tool, perhaps, but one that could still be used until it snapped. "He is mute," Thorn spat, the word dripping with disdain. "A sailor who cannot call out Tharshy blows is as useless as a gun without powder." "He has hands," Garrow countered, "and he eats less than a man." Thorn remained silent for a long moment. The ship rolled beneath them, groaning in protest against the Atlantic swell. Silas squeezed his eyes shut, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Don't throw me over. Please, I'll scrub. I'll bleed. Just don't throw me into the cold." Finally, Thorn retracted his boot. "Very well," the captain said, turning his back with a swirl of his heavy coat. "But mark me, Garrow. The sea does not suffer dead weight. If the boy does not work, he swims." Thorn began to walk away, his iron heels biting into the wood once more. But before he reached the stairs, he stopped. He didn't turn around. "And wash him," Thorn commanded, his voice echoing in the hollow belly of the ship. "He smells of the land. I will not have my ship smelling of dirt and cowardice." The hatch slammed shut, leaving Silas and Garrow in the dim light of the single lantern. "Mister," Garrow sighed, a sound that seemed to scrape against his throat. He was a large man, barrel-chested, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and left out in the rain for 50 years. He hooked the lantern onto a nail and looked down at Silas. "You are a lucky little rat," Garrow grunted. He reached down, grabbing Silas by the arm. His grip was not gentle, but it wasn't cruel like the captain's. It was merely practical. "Up," Garrow ordered. "On your feet. The Pequod 2 is not a nursery." Silas scrambled to stand, his legs numb from hours in the barrel. He swayed, grabbing the crate for support. His head spun. The lack of food and water had turned his blood to lead. "Come on," Garrow said, pointing to the ladder. "Let's introduce you to your new family, though I doubt they'll welcome another mouth to feed." Silas followed the first mate up the ladder. Every rung was a struggle. His hands, raw and shaking, gripped the splintered wood. With every step upward, the air changed. The stagnant warmth of the hold gave way to a biting chill that seeped down from the hatch above. When Silas emerged onto the main deck, the world assaulted him. It was night. The sky was a vast, bruised purple, scattered with stars that looked like shards of ice. The moon hung low, casting a pale, ghostly light over the heaving ocean. Silas gasped. The cold hit him like a physical slap, instantly freezing the sweat on his skin. The wind howled through the rigging, a mournful, shrieking song that sounded like 1,000 violins being tortured. He looked around. The deck of the Pequod 2 was a landscape of shadows and ropes. Massive masts pierced the sky, groaning under the pressure of the wind. Sailors moved like spectres in the gloom, their faces hidden beneath thick wool caps and oilskins. They stopped their work as Garrow dragged Silas toward the mainmast. 20 pairs of eyes turned to look at him, eyes hard as flint, eyes that had seen whales torn apart and men drowned. They looked at his oversized trousers, his dirt-smeared face, and his trembling hands. "What's this refuse? Mr. Garrow?" a voice called out from the shadows. A man with a scar running from his ear to his chin stepped forward. He held a splicing knife in his hand. "Fresh meat," Garrow announced, pushing Silas forward into the circle of light cast by the deck lantern. "Found him in a flour cask. Captain says he stays." A ripple of laughter went through the crew, but it wasn't joyful. It was a dry, rasping sound devoid of mirth. "Stays?" the scarred man sneered. "Does he know a bowline from a hangman's knot? Does he know the difference between a sperm whale and a log?" Silas shrank back. He wanted to speak, to defend himself, to say "I can learn." But the stitches in his mind pulled tight. His mouth opened, but only silence poured out. "Cat got your tongue, boy?" another sailor jeered. "He's mute," Garrow said flatly. The laughter died instantly. Superstition ran deep in the blood of whalers. A man with a crossed eye was bad luck. A woman on board was a curse. But a mute? A person who could not speak was often seen as a vessel for spirits, or a harbinger of doom. The scarred man took a step back, making a sign against evil on his chest. "A silent one," he whispered, the mockery replaced by unease. "The sea doesn't like silence. It means the devil is listening." "Enough," Garrow barked. "He's here to work the try-works, not to preach. You, Stubb, get him a bucket of seawater and a rag, clean him up. Then throw him in the forecastle." Garrow turned to leave, but he paused and looked back at Silas. "Your name is Mute now," Garrow said, sealing Silas's identity with the weight of an anchor. "Don't let me catch you idling. Mute. On this ship, if you don't bleed, you don't eat." Garrow disappeared into the aft cabin. Silas was left alone with the crew. The scarred man, Stubb, spat on the deck, missing Silas's boot by an inch. Someone kicked a bucket toward him. It slid across the slick deck and hit his shin. "Scrub!" Stubb ordered, pointing to a patch of dried blood near the rail, remnants of a seal or a fish caught earlier. "Start earning your keep, ghost boy." Silas fell to his knees. The wood was freezing, coated in a thin layer of rime ice. He dipped the rag into the bucket of freezing seawater. His hands, already numb, screamed in protest as the salt water bit into his cuts. He began to scrub. Swish, scrub, swish, scrub. As he worked, he lowered his head, trying to ignore the hostile glares of the men. He focused on the sound, and then he heard it. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the crew. Silas stopped scrubbing. He tilted his head slightly to the left, his ear facing the dark, churning water, deep below the surface, miles away. Something was moving. A low, rhythmic thrumming. It was too organic to be a machine, too powerful to be a fish. It was a sound that vibrated not just in the air, but in the water itself, travelling through the hull, up through his knees, and into his skull. Thrum. Click. Click. Thrum. It was a song of immense sorrow and ancient hunger. The whales, they were out there, and they were singing to the ship that had come to kill them. Silas looked up at the horizon. The fear was still there, curled in his gut like the rat in the barrel. But for the first time, a new feeling rose beside it, a strange, terrifying awe. He was no longer in the barrel. He was in the belly of a different beast now, and this one was hungry. "Scrub!" Stubb yelled, kicking Silas in the ribs. Silas gasped, pain flaring hot in his side. He dipped the rag back into the freezing water. He was alive. For now. Chapter 2. The Price of Air. The forecastle of the Pequod 2 was not a room. It was a cave carved out of damp wood and misery, located in the bow of the ship, directly beneath the main deck. It was a triangular dungeon where 20 men were packed like sardines in a tin. As Mr. Garrow shoved Silas down the narrow companionway, a wall of heat and stench rose up to meet them. It was a physical barrier. The air here was thick, curdled with the smell of unwashed bodies, stale tobacco smoke, wet wool, and the sour, lingering odour of vomit. It was the smell of men who lived, slept, and died in the same clothes for months on end. "Get in," Garrow grunted, pushing Silas forward into the gloom. Silas stumbled, catching himself on a wooden beam. His eyes, still adjusting from the moonlight above, struggled to pierce the shadows. A singular oil lamp swung from the ceiling, casting a sickly yellow light that swayed with the rhythm of the ocean. The shadows of the hammocks danced on the walls like swinging corpses. "Find a bunk," Garrow said, his voice devoid of sympathy. "Miller's hammock is empty. Port side, bottom tier. Don't touch anyone else's gear, or you'll lose a finger." With that, the first mate turned and climbed back up the ladder, taking the clean air with him. Silas stood alone in the aisle. To his left and right, rows of hammocks hung in tiers, swaying gently. From within the bundles of dirty blankets came a cacophony of sounds, the rasping snore of a giant, the whimper of a man dreaming of home, the wet, hacking cough of a smoker's lungs. He spotted the empty hammock. It was a sagging piece of canvas, stained dark with sweat and oil. Above it, carved into the wooden beam with a knife, were the initials J. M. 1848, James Miller, the man who had died of the flux. This was a dead man's bed. Silas approached it slowly. He could feel the eyes of the few men who were still awake watching him. They lay in the shadows, their cigarettes glowing like the eyes of wolves in a forest. He didn't dare look at them. He climbed into the hammock. It was difficult. The canvas swung wildly, threatening to dump him onto the floor. He had to grab the edges, pulling himself up like a spider. When he finally settled in, the canvas wrapped around him, tight and suffocating. It was cold, despite the body heat of 20 men, The dampness of the Atlantic seeped through the hull. The blanket he found inside was thin, scratchy, and smelled of sickness. Silas pulled it up to his chin. He stared at the wooden planks above him, the bottom of another man's bunk. A cockroach crawled across the wood, its antennae twitching. I'm safe, he lied to himself. I'm not in the water. But he wasn't safe. He was an intruder. You're in Miller's spot, a voice whispered from the darkness across the aisle. Silas froze. Miller died screaming in that hammock, the voice continued. It was raspy, wet. They say the flux ate his insides. The canvas is probably still soaked with his bad luck. Silas didn't answer. He couldn't. He just gripped the edges of the blanket tighter, his knuckles turning white. Mute, eh? The voice chuckled softly. Maybe that's for the best. Words don't buy you much out here. Only muscle and blood. The voice faded into a coughing fit. Silas closed his eyes, forcing himself to breathe shallowly, trying to filter the stench through his teeth. Sleep was a battlefield. Every time he drifted off, the ship would lurch, or a man would shout in his sleep, or the image of Captain Thorne's iron heel would flash in his mind. But exhaustion was a relentless tide. Eventually, it pulled him under. Clang, clang, clang. The sound shattered the world. It was sharp, metallic, and cruel. All hands ahoy! The forecastle exploded into chaos. Men tumbled out of hammocks, cursing and spitting. The peaceful rhythm of sleep was replaced instantly by the violence of the morning watch. Silas was thrown from his dream of a warm bakery directly onto the cold, hard floor. Someone had kicked the bottom of his hammock. Up, rat! It was Stubb, the scarred man. He was already dressed, his face a mask of morning aggression. Sun's up. The well waits for no man. Silas scrambled to his feet. His body screamed in protest. Every muscle ached from the tension of the previous day, and his stomach felt like a hollow pit gnawing at his spine. Stubb heard it. He grinned, revealing yellow, jagged teeth. Hungry? He asked. Good. Hunger makes you sharp. Move. Silas was swept up in the tide of bodies moving toward the ladder. He was shoved, elbowed, and stepped on. He was the smallest thing in a river of giants. On deck, the dawn was breaking. It was a grey, bleeding dawn. The sky was the colour of a bruise, and the sea was a churning mass of slate and foam. The wind was colder than the night before, carrying needles of ice that stung the face. The crew gathered around the galley hatch for the morning ration. The cook, a massive man with one eye and a beard stiff with grease, was ladling out a grey, steaming slop into wooden bowls. "Bagoo," the cook shouted. "Hot and thick. Eat it or wear it." Silas stood at the back of the line, shivering in his thin shirt. He watched the men receive their bowls. They ate standing up, shoveling the food into their mouths with wooden spoons or their fingers, eyes scanning the horizon even as they chewed. When Silas reached the front, the cook paused. He looked at the boy, then at the empty bowl Silas held out with trembling hands. "The stowaway," the cook grunted. He dipped the ladle into the pot, stirring the bottom. He pulled up a scoop of the grey mush. Splat. It was half a ladle, barely enough to cover the bottom of the bowl. Silas looked up, his eyes wide. "Captain's orders," the cook said, wiping his hands on a filthy apron. "Half rations for the boy until he earns his keep. You want full bowl? You kill a whale." Silas stared at the food. It looked like glue. A few black specks floated in it, weevils, boiled dead along with the oats. He didn't care. It was hot. He retreated to a corner near the windlass, away from the wind. He brought the bowl to his lips and shoveled the tasteless, gritty mush into his mouth. It burned his tongue, but the heat spread down his throat, a fleeting comfort in the freezing world. "Enjoying the maggots, boy?" Silas looked up. A young sailor, perhaps only 17, was leaning against the rail. He had a kinder face than the others, freckled and pale, but his eyes held the same hardened look of the sea. "Don't pick them out," the sailor advised, gesturing to the bowl with his own spoon. It's meat, protein, you'll need it. Silas paused, a weevil resting on his spoon. He looked at the sailor, then back at the insect. He ate it. The sailor nodded, a grim approval. Name's Pip, not the one from the book. Just Pip. You're mute, right? Silas nodded once. Well, mute, Pip said, looking out at the endless grey water. Welcome to the Pequod 2. We hunt oil to light the lamps of London and New York. And in exchange, we give the sea our souls, piece by piece. Tweet! Starboard watch, to the rigging, larboard watch, scrub the deck, mute, mister. Garrow's voice boomed across the deck like thunder. Silas dropped his spoon. He scrambled to his feet, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. Garrow was standing by the try-works, 2 massive brick furnaces built into the deck, housing giant iron pots used for boiling whale blubber. They were cold now, covered in soot and grease from the last voyage. Come here, boy, Garrow commanded. Silas ran. He slipped on a patch of ice but caught his balance, skidding to a halt in front of the first mate. Garrow pointed a thick finger at the try-works. The furnaces were dark, gaping maws, black with centuries of burnt carbon. The brickwork is clogged with soot, Garrow said. If we light the fires now, the ship burns down. Someone needs to go inside and scrape the flues. He looked at the hulking sailors around him, then down at Silas. You fit, Garrow said simply. He handed Silas a short-handled metal scraper and a wire brush. Climb inside, Garrow ordered. Scrape until you see the red brick, and don't come out until every inch of soot is gone. In. Silas looked at the opening of the furnace beneath the great iron pots. It was tiny, barely wider than his shoulders. It was a tunnel into darkness. Claustrophobia clawed at his throat. The memory of the barrel was still fresh, the phantom sensation of the wood pressing against his spine. No, his mind screamed. Not again. Not in the dark. He didn't move. He stood frozen, staring at the black hole. Deaf as well as dumb, Garrow growled. He grabbed Silas by the back of his neck. His grip was like a vice. Garrow shoved him toward the brick archway. In you go! Silas fell to his knees at the mouth of the furnace. The smell hit him instantly. Acrid. Bitter. The smell of 1,000 dead fires. It smelled like cremation. He looked back. Garrow was waiting. Stubb was watching, arms crossed, a smirk on his face. Pip looked away. There was no escape. Silas took a breath of the freezing air. The last clean thing he would taste for hours. Then, gripping the scraper like a lifeline, he crawled into the black throat of the try-works. Darkness swallowed him again. But this time, he wasn't hiding. He was working. The space was impossibly tight. He had to lie flat on his stomach, his nose inches from the soot-covered floor. It was colder in here than on deck. The bricks held the chill of the iron pots above. Silas reached up with the scraper. Scritch! Soot fell into his eyes. He blinked, tears forming, turning the dust into black mud on his face. He coughed, the sound booming in the confined space, deafening him. Scritch! Scritch! He began to scrape. He scraped for his life. He scraped because if he didn't, the captain would throw him into the sea. He scraped because this was the price of air. Time lost its meaning. There was only the sound of metal on brick, the taste of ash, and the cramping of his muscles. And then, he heard it again. Through the brickwork conducted by the iron of the trypots which were bolted to the deck, which was bolted to the hull. Creak. Snap. It wasn't the whale song this time. It was sharp, like a gunshot muffled by a pillow. Silas stopped scraping. He pressed his ear against the cold brick floor of the furnace. Snap! It was coming from the keel, right below where the mainmast stepped into the hull. A structural weakness. A fracture in the spine of the ship. To any other ear, it would have been lost in the groan of the rigging. But to Silas, it was a scream. The ship was hurting. The Pequod 2 was old and she was brittle. Silas lay there in the dark and covered in soot, listening to the ship dying by inches. He wanted to run out. He wanted to pull Garrow's coat and mime the breaking of a stick. He wanted to warn them. But who would listen to a soot-stained mute? Who would believe the boy who crawled in the ashes? Faster. Mute. "I don't hear scraping," Garrow's voice bellowed from the outside world, muffled and distant. Silas squeezed his eyes shut. He gripped the scraper tighter. Scritch. Scritch. He buried the sound of the dying ship under the sound of his own labour. For 3 hours, Silas became part of the furnace. He inhaled darkness and exhaled grey dust. The soot matted his hair, clogged his nostrils, and coated his tongue with a film of bitter grease. His arms, screaming from the repetitive motion, moved like the pistons of a dying engine. Scrape. Breathe. Cough. Scrape. When the metal scraper finally hit the back wall of the firebox, Silas collapsed, his cheek pressed against the cold, soot-covered floor. He lay there for a moment, trembling, listening to the muffled thrum of the ocean outside. "Out!" Garrow's voice boomed from the entrance, distorted by the narrow tunnel. "Unless you want me to light the fire with you inside." Silas scrambled backward. He wiggled his hips, pushing against the floor with his raw palms, retreating like a worm from a grave. He tumbled out onto the deck. The light was blinding. Even the grey, overcast sky of the Atlantic felt like staring into the sun after the absolute blackness of the try-works. Silas gasped, greedy for the clean, salt-laden air, but his lungs rejected the sudden cold. He doubled over, hacking up black phlegm onto the pristine white scrubbed deck. "Filthy," a voice sneered. Silas looked up through watering eyes. A circle of sailors had gathered. They weren't looking at him with pity. They were looking at him with amusement. He was no longer a boy. He was a creature of shadow. Every inch of his skin, every strand of his hair, his clothes, everything was coated in a thick, velvety layer of black soot. Only the whites of his eyes and the pink of his gums were visible, giving him the appearance of a startled demon. "Look at that," Stubb laughed, leaning on his broom. "We caught a white boy and cooked him into a darkie." The crew roared with laughter. It was a cruel, sharp sound that cut deeper than the wind. "Mister," Garrow stepped forward. He didn't laugh. He inspected the pile of soot Silas had dragged out with him. He peered into the furnace with a critical eye. "Passable," the first mate grunted. He looked down at Silas. "You look like the devil's own chimney sweep. Don't think this earns you a bath. Fresh water is for drinking. You want to clean up, wait for rain, or jump?" He gestured to the churning, freezing ocean. Silas stood up slowly. His legs shook. He looked at his hands. They were black claws. He touched his face. It felt like a mask. "Back to work," Garrow barked, clapping his hands. "The wind is picking up. You, mute, coil the ropes on the quarterdeck. And don't get soot on the captain's railing or I'll skin you." Silas nodded, head bowed. He walked through the gauntlet of sailors. Some stepped aside as if he were contagious. Others deliberately bumped into him, sending clouds of black dust into the air. He was an outcast among outcasts. A pariah on a ship of fools. The rest of the day was a blur of labour. Silas learned that on a whaling ship, there is no such thing as finished. There is only next. He coiled ropes until his fingers bled. He scrubbed the scuppers. He polished the brass of the binnacle until he could see his own soot-stained reflection in the metal. And all the while, he listened. The ship talked to him. The Pequod 2 was not just wood and canvas. She was a choir of stress and strain. Silas learned to distinguish the voices. The foremast sang a high, tight soprano when the wind gusted. The rudder groaned a low, grumbling bass as the helmsman fought the current. The deck planks whispered under the boots of the men. But underneath it all, that sharp, terrifying crack in the keel remained. It didn't happen often, only when the ship pitched violently into a deep trough. but every time it did, Silas felt it in his teeth. Snap. It was a ticking clock. A countdown that only he could hear. Sunset brought no relief, only a deepening of the cold. The temperature plummeted as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sea in shades of violet and blood. Supper. The word was magic. The men abandoned their tasks, streaming toward the galley for their evening ration. Silas followed, staying in the shadows. He was starving. The half-bowl of burgoo from the morning had evaporated from his stomach hours ago. The cook was serving salt pork and hardtack tonight. The smell of the boiled meat was intoxicating. It smelled of life. Silas reached the front of the line. He held out his bowl, his black hands trembling. The cook looked at him. He looked at the soot. He curled his lip. "You're dirty, boy," the cook said. "You'll contaminate the ladles." Silas stood there, the bowl hovering in the air. He opened his mouth to make a sound, a plea. Anything. "Please." I worked. I scraped. I am empty. But the cook just shook his head. "Clean hands or no meat. That's the rule." He waved Silas away. "Next!" Silas was shoved aside by a hungry harpooner. He stumbled back, the empty bowl clattering to the deck. No one helped him. No one even looked. They were too busy guarding their own plates, too busy consuming the warmth that Silas was denied. He picked up his bowl. It was light. So incredibly light. He walked away from the light of the galley. He went to the leeward side of the ship where the wind was blocked by the hull. He sat down on a coil of rope, hugging his knees to his chest. The soot on his skin, once a badge of shame, was now his only blanket. It trapped a microscopic layer of heat against his body. He looked at the hardtack, a single rock-hard biscuit that he had managed to salvage from his pocket from the morning. It was stale, hard as brick, and likely filled with worms. He gnawed on it. Crunch, crunch. It tasted of dust. But he chewed it slowly, letting his saliva soften the stone-like bread, extracting every calorie. As he ate, he looked up. The sky had cleared, and there, dancing above the masts, were the lights, the aurora borealis. Green and purple ribbons unfurled across the heavens, shimmering and twisting like silent spirits. They were beautiful, terrifyingly beautiful. They illuminated the endless expanse of the ice-dark sea, revealing the white caps that looked like the teeth of a million wolves. Silas stopped chewing. He watched the lights. Back in the orphanage, the nuns had said that the lights in the sky were angels. But here, on this ship of blood and grease, they didn't look like angels. They looked like ghosts. The ghosts of the whales, the ghosts of the men who had fallen overboard. And then he heard it again, louder this time. Crack! Silas dropped his biscuit. He pressed his ear to the deck. The vibration travelled through the wood, up his arm. It wasn't just a snap this time. It was a shift. Something deep in the ship's belly had moved. A rib had given way. Above him, the lookout in the crow's nest yelled, "Ice! Ice to windward!" But the lookout was wrong. The danger wasn't just outside. Silas looked down at the deck planks beneath his hands. He knew. The Pequod 2 was already broken. She was just waiting for the right wave to die. And he was the only one listening to her death rattle. Silas picked up the piece of hardtack, wiped the soot from it, and put it in his mouth. He swallowed the dry lump. The air here cost more than labour. It cost silence. He stood up and walked toward the dark hole of the forecastle. He would sleep. He would dream of fire, and he would wait for the water. Chapter 3: The Grease and the Glory. "There she blows, a humpback, off the larboard bow." The cry dropped from the sky like a lightning bolt. It hit the deck of the Pequod 2 and transformed the world instantly. One moment, the ship was a floating hearse of bored, freezing men. The next, it was a hive of frantic, bloodthirsty energy. Silas was scrubbing the main hatch when the shout came. He was nearly trampled. "Clear the way! Mute!" Stubb roared, shoving Silas into a pile of netting. Silas scrambled out of the way, pressing his back against the bulwark. He watched, wide-eyed, as the choreography of death unfolded. It was a dance practiced 1,000 times. The whaleboats, suspended on davits like sleeping bats, were swung out over the water. Harpooneers snatched their iron lances, their eyes gleaming with a feverish light that Silas had never seen before. This was not just work. This was the hunt. Captain Thorne stood on the quarterdeck, a telescope pressed to his eye. He looked like a statue of judgment. "Lower away," Thorne commanded, his voice cut through the wind, cold and precise. 3 boats hit the water with a splash. The oars bit into the grey swell. The men rowed with a savage rhythm, their backs heaving in unison, propelling the fragile wooden shells toward the plume of mist on the horizon. Silas remained on the mothership. He, the cook, the blacksmith, and the shipkeeper were the only ones left behind. The shipkeepers. The ones unworthy of the glory. He climbed onto the rail, forbidden. He knew, but no one was watching, and stared out at the sea. The whale was a mountain of black flesh rising from the deep. It breached, its massive body defying gravity for a heartbeat, water cascading off its flanks like diamonds, before crashing down with a sound that shook the very air. Boom! To Silas, it was magnificent. It was a god. But to the men in the boats, it was just barrels of oil with a tail. He watched the tiny boats circle the Leviathan. He saw the harpooner in the lead boat, Queequeg's counterpart on this ship, a giant Polynesian named Tana, stand up. He poised the harpoon. Silas flinched. Even from a mile away, he felt the violence of the strike. The harpoon flew. The water boiled white. The line smoked as it ran out. The god screamed. It wasn't a sound human ears were meant to hear. It was a low-frequency vibration of pure agony that travelled through the water and rattled the hull of the Pequod II. Silas clutched the railing, his own chest tightening as if he were the one skewered. The battle raged for hours. The Nantucket sleigh ride. The boat dragged by the wounded whale, cut a foaming scar across the ocean. By the time the sun began to dip, painting the sky in colours of bruised plum and arterial red, the struggle was over. The great beast floated belly up, a dark island in a red sea. The glory was finished. Now began the grease. Hauling the carcass alongside the ship was a feat of engineering and brute force. When the 80-ton body was finally chained to the starboard side of the Pequod II, the entire ship listed heavily to the right. The crack in the keel, Silas's secret companion groaned. Creak. It was a protest. The ship was saying, "I am too old for this weight." But the crew was deaf to it. They were drunk on victory. "Rig the cutting stage," Garrow shouted. Torches were lit, baskets of iron shavings saturated in oil. Bug lights were hung over the side, casting a smoky, hellish glare onto the water and the dead whale. The Pequod II became a slaughterhouse floating in the abyss. Silas was handed a long pole with a hook at the end. "You're a spade cleaner now, boy," Stubb said, his face smeared with sweat and excitement. "Stand by the rail, huh?" When the spades get dull or clogged with gristle, you clean them and don't fall in. The sharks are already here. Silas looked over the side. The water was boiling. Hundreds of sharks, attracted by the river of blood flowing from the whale, swarmed around the carcass. Their fins cut the water like serrated knives. They tore chunks of flesh from the whale even as the men worked on it. The smell hit him then. It was not just the fishy smell of the sea. It was a thick, sweet, cloying stench of raw blubber, musk, and blood. It coated the back of his throat like oil. Silas gagged, covering his mouth with his soot-stained sleeve. "Breathe it in," Stubb laughed, plunging a razor-sharp cutting spade into the whale's neck. "That's the smell of money, boy. That's the smell of a warm bed in New Bedford." The process of cutting in began. It was a grotesque striptease. The men peeled the blubber off the whale in a long, spiralling strip, the blanket piece, as the windlass turned, rolling the carcass over and over in the water. Silas watched in horror and fascination. The blubber was thick, white, and heavy. As it was hoisted onto the deck, it dripped oil and blood, turning the wooden planks into a skating rink of gore. "Watch your footing," Garrow bellowed. A massive slab of blubber, weighing 2 tons, swung over the deck, suspended by the main tackle. It swayed with the roll of the ship. Thud. The ship shuddered. Silas felt the vibration travel up through his boots. Beneath the noise of the windlass and the shouting men, he heard the keel complain again. Snap. Grin. The fracture was widening. The weight of the blubber on the deck, combined with the drag of the carcass alongside, was twisting the ship's spine. Silas looked at Captain Thorne. The captain stood near the mainmast, supervising the operation. He looked calm, almost bored. Did he not feel it? Did he not feel the deck tilting a fraction of a degree too far? "Hey, mute!" Silas snapped his head around. One of the flensers, a man named Flask, held out a cutting spade. The blade was covered in tough, white sinew. "Clean it," Flask yelled. "I need to cut." Silas grabbed the spade. It was heavy, the handle slippery with blood. He used his hook to tear the gristle away from the blade. His hands were instantly coated in the slime. It was warm. The whale was still warm. He handed it back. Flask snatched it and went back to hacking at the mountain of flesh. The work continued through the night. The bug lights burned fiercely, sending black smoke into the sails. The crew looked like demons in the flickering orange light, covered in blood from head to toe, slipping and sliding on the treacherous deck. Silas was everywhere, fetching water, cleaning spades, throwing sand on the slippery planks. He was exhausted. His arms felt like lead. But the fear kept him moving, the fear of the captain's boot, and the deeper, colder fear of the sound in the hull. Around midnight, the case, the head of the sperm whale, a massive tank filled with the purest oil, was severed and hoisted. "Steady!" Garrow shouted. "She's a heavy one." The case hung suspended over the main hatch. It was a reservoir of liquid gold. "Lower it!" As the case descended into the hold, Silas saw something. The main beam of the deck, the massive piece of oak that supported the weight of the tackle, bowed. It didn't just bend, it sagged. Silas dropped his bucket. He stepped forward, his mouth opening in a silent scream. "Stop! It's too heavy! The beam is rotten!" But no one looked at him. Their eyes were fixed on the oil. The beam held, for now. The case disappeared into the hold. The crew cheered. "We're rich, boys," someone shouted. Silas didn't cheer. He backed away, trembling. He looked at the deck planks near the mainmast. The caulking, the tar used to seal the gaps between the planks, had popped out. A tiny line of black tar lay curled on the white wood like a dead worm. The ship was stretching. She was being pulled apart by her own greed. "To the try-works," Thorne ordered. "Light the fires, we boil tonight." The second phase of hell began. The blubber was minced into Bible leaves, thin slices that would boil faster and thrown into the great iron pots. The fires were lit beneath them. Soon, black smoke billowed from the brick chimneys. The smell changed from raw blood to burning fat. It was a smell that permeated everything: hair, skin, clothes, even the soul. Silas was ordered to feed the fire. "Use the fritters," the cook yelled, pointing to the shriveled brown scraps of blubber that floated in the boiling oil. "They burn hotter than wood." Silas used a pitchfork to scoop the fritters out of the pot and toss them into the furnace beneath. He was burning the whale with its own body. It was a cycle of consumption that made him dizzy. The fire roared. The flames cast dancing shadows on the sails. The ship was a volcano sailing through the ice. Silas stood before the open mouth of the furnace, the same furnace he'd crawled inside that morning. Now it was an inferno. The heat singed his eyebrows. the soot on his face mixed with sweat, running down his neck in black rivulets. He looked up at the smoke rising into the polar night. He wondered if God was watching, or if God had stopped looking at this part of the world a long time ago. "More feed!" the cook screamed, slapping Silas on the back. Silas shovelled, and then the wind changed. It happened in a heartbeat. The steady gale that had been blowing from the north suddenly died. The sails flapped uselessly against the masts. Silence. The smoke from the try-works didn't blow away anymore. It pooled on the deck, a thick, choking fog. "What is it?" a sailor whispered. Captain Thorne walked to the rail. He sniffed the air. "Barometer," he said softly. "Check the glass." Garrow ran to the binnacle. He looked at the instrument and paled beneath his layer of grease. "It's dropped, sir. Bottomed out." Thorne looked at the horizon. There was no line between sea and sky anymore. Just a wall of blackness, advancing not with wind, but with a terrifying stillness. "A white squall," Thorne whispered. He turned to the crew, his voice suddenly exploding like a cannon. "Cut the carcass loose! Douse the fires! Furl the sails, now! Move, you dogs, move!" Panic erupted. But it was too late. The wall of wind hit them before the first rope could be untied. The world tilted. It wasn't a roll, it was a capsizing. The force of the wind against the masts, combined with the drag of the 80-ton carcass chained to the starboard side, pinned the Pequod 2 down. The deck became a wall. The ocean became the ceiling. Silas didn't have time to scream. He lost his footing instantly. He slid across the slick, blood-greased planks, tumbling toward the scuppers. "Hold fast!" Garrow roared, his voice barely audible over the shrieking wind. Sefex. Tieng kim loai nang trot tren san. Tieng da soido rasan gehuot gai tieng sio lon. Heavy metal sliding, boiling oil splashing on wet wood with loud hiss. Disaster struck the try-works. As the ship leaned dangerously to the right, the boiling oil in the great iron pot sloshed over the rim. It cascaded down onto the brickwork, onto the deck, and onto the legs of the men struggling to stay upright. Screams of agony joined the chorus of the storm. The oil was 300 degrees. It melted through wool and skin in an instant. "The fire!" Cook screamed. "Douse the fire!" But the water crashing over the rail did that for them. A wall of green, freezing sea swept across the waist of the ship, colliding with the spilled oil and the burning furnace. Steam exploded. A cloud of scalding white fog blinded everyone. Silas was small. He had jammed himself into the gap between the bulwark and a coil of rope. The water hammered him, trying to wash him overboard, but he held on. He was a barnacle. He was a part of the wood. Through the steam and the spray, he saw Stubb. The second mate was hanging off the rail, an axe in his hand, hacking wildly at the heavy iron chains that held the whale carcass. "Cut her loose!" Thorne's voice cut through the chaos from the quarterdeck. "Cut or we sink!" Clang, clang, snap. Stubb swung the axe like a madman. The chain parted. The effect was instantaneous and violent. Freed from the massive counterweight of the dead whale, the Pequod 2 whipped back upright with the force of a catapult. Whoomph! The violence of the motion threw men across the deck like dice. Silas was launched from his hiding spot. He flew through the air, hitting the side of the try-works with a sickening thud. Pain exploded in his shoulder. He collapsed on the deck, gasping, the taste of blood in his mouth. The ship rocked wildly, trying to find her centre of gravity. The storm was still raging, hammering the hull with fists of wind and water. Silas lay on his back, staring up at the mainmast. Lightning didn't strike, but the static electricity in the air, St. Elmo's fire, began to glow at the tips of the spars. Ghostly blue flames danced on the yardarms. And then he heard it. The sound he had been dreading. The ship had righted herself. Yes. But the violence of the snapback had been too much. Deep in the skeleton of the vessel, the keel shifted. Ka-ack! It wasn't a whisper this time. It was a gunshot. Silas saw the main deck beam, the massive timber directly above the hold, shudder. A hairline fracture appeared in the wood, right before his eyes. It ran like a bolt of lightning through the grain, stopping just inches from the hatch. Dust drifted down from the crack. The ship was wounded. She was bleeding sawdust. "Secure the deck!" Garrow was yelling, pulling a sailor out of the scuppers. "Lash the pots, check the hold!" Silas couldn't move. He stared at the crack in the beam. He knew what it meant. The spine was broken. The Pequod 2 was no longer a fortress against the sea. She was a coffin waiting to close. He looked toward the bow. The darkness was absolute, a wall of black velvet. But his ears, his cursed gifted ears, picked up a new sound. Under the roar of the wind, under the groan of the dying ship, there was a sound coming from the north. Groan. Grind. It sounded like teeth grinding together. It sounded like mountains colliding. Ice. Not just a berg. A field. They were being driven straight into the pack. Silas tried to stand up. He had to warn them. He had to point. He had to make a sound. He opened his mouth. He screamed with all his might, but only a silent puff of steam escaped his lips. The wind swallowed his silence, and the Pequod 2, blind and broken, charged headlong into the white hell. The beast is wounded, and the ocean smells blood. The storm has stripped away their pride, but the true enemy is waiting in the dark, silent and cold as the grave. Silas knows the end is coming. But can a boy without a voice save a crew that has lost its soul? The ice is waiting, and it is hungry. Find out who survives the impact in Part 2. Subscribe now, ring the bell. Don't let the cold take you. The story continues.